Hello, America. Welcome to your Leo Nation, where we believe in and support the rule of law. I am the Chief, Mark Garrett, and joining us today is another gentleman who I know just from watching him, like millions of you probably have, also believes in the rule of law, and that is Dr. Darrin Porcher. Darrin, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the show.
Mark, thanks so much for having me, and I was looking forward to appearing on the podcast.
Well, as we were looking forward to having you. So, Darrin, I know that you are a retired NYPD lieutenant. You also have a doctorate from Fordham University. Before we get into what we're going to talk about today, which is your take on the Daniel Penny incident investigation, why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself so people can just know the perspective you have on this entire incident?
Sure, I'm a former Army veteran. 4 years on active duty, 16 years as a reservist. I was an officer. I retired as an officer. I worked at the United Nations after coming out of the military for a year, and then I became a member of the NYPD. I worked in the NYPD for 20 years. During my 20-year tenure in the NYPD, I performed a multitude of different tasks. I was a police officer in the South Bronx. I was a detective. I was an undercover. I was a sergeant in a police academy. I was a lieutenant up in Harlem. I worked every borough in the city, doing a little everything. In addition to that, from an educational perspective, I have a bachelor's degree, I have a master's degree, and I have a doctorate degree from Fordham University. And I do a lot of this television stuff, but what's close to my heart is how the social contract is upheld in a place like New York. When we look at how crime is spiraling out of control, how the quality of life is in the toilet based on elected officials, I try to speak out as much as I can on various media outlets such as Fox News, CNN, NBC, and a lot of the local channels, and I try to get out my perspective. Now, it's interesting. Oftentimes, people ask me, "Hey, you do CNN, you do MSNBC, why do you do that?" What we do as law enforcement advocates is we're apolitical, and we speak to the testament of the social contract being upheld and how crime is ravaging our great country. And that's the focus that I have in any and every interview that I do. So it doesn't matter who is the commissioner of the interview. My messaging is the same. In addition to that, I also work as a criminal justice expert, and I testify in cases all over the country. And I've represented the San Diego Sheriff's Department, the Chicago Police Department, a multitude of different police departments throughout the country. So, as well as plaintiffs, in addition, I've had cases where, as I give you an example, the Travis Scott case down in Houston, Texas, where everyone was stampeded. I represented the plaintiffs in that case, and I represent plaintiffs all over the country. But that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Well, I'll tell you right now, it's a big nutshell. It really is. And, one of the phrases that you use, or a couple of things you talked about, because I was going to comment on that, Darrin, about I've seen you on all those outlets that you referred to, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, in other words, across the board. And you talked about two things. One was the social contract, really between citizens of this country and law enforcement. And you talked about your message is the same. And I'll tell you right now, I really, really implore people to check you out, because it doesn't matter what desk you're sitting at. In other words, in front of what camera, it's the same thing. And this really exemplifies really what law enforcement, what the rule of law is. It's the same message. It's the same rules for everybody. So your consistency, I think, is beyond reproach. And this is one of the reasons I was so excited to have you on the show. Thank you for the good background information. You talked about being a detective with NYPD, and it's one of the things I really want to get into. Last week we did a show, and it was primarily about Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely, of course, and we talked about really the racial aspect of the entire incident, the trial, prosecution, and there's always overlap. No matter what we're talking about just the investigation part of it and the interrogation and the trial, it's hard to separate really one element from the other. But I did want to focus on today, really from the law enforcement side, in NYPD's side perspective, role, process in this, the investigation. And you talked about being a detective. One thing I'd like to ask you is just go back to the beginning. In other words, what happens when something like this happens? What is the process? In other words, you have patrol officers, maybe transit officers who are initially on scene. What's the process from the incident occurring to someone being questioned, interrogated, and maybe taken into custody?
Well, I give you a situation such as the Daniel Penny episode. When the incident happened, it was Daniel Penny that requested bystanders to call the police to assist and possibly take Jordan Neely into custody. So when police responded on the scene, one of the first things that police do is ask what happened. Of course, they asked what happened. Medical aid was introduced by EMS, and then at that point, police felt that it was best to continue an interview with Daniel Penny in an uncontaminated environment. When I say an uncontaminated environment, when you're on that subway platform, you have people that can possibly intercede on what's being stated. So it was best to bring Daniel Penny into a police interview room. An interview was conducted, not an interrogation. The difference between an interview and an interrogation is that with an interview, you're free to leave at any point in time and you're not under arrest. With an interrogation, you don't have the ability to leave on your own accord. So this was an interview. And during this interview, Daniel Penny provided willful information as to what transpired on that particular subway car. Daniel Penny spoke to the the aspect of how Jordan Neely was threatening other passengers on the train, and people felt as if their safety was in danger. So as a result, Daniel Penny and another individual interceded and restrained Jordan Neely for the purpose of police responding and taking control of the situation. And it was unfortunate that Mr. Neely lost his life, but you have to also look at where Mr. Neely was. He had a lot of comprehensive challenges within his physical characteristics, such as one, he was on K2. He was a person that was experiencing a mental health episode, and he was homeless. And by no means does any of that amount to someone losing their life. But at the same token, you have to take notice to these are issues that were plaguing Mr. Neely. So there was a restraint that was applied by Daniel Penny, which resulted or manifested in him losing his life. Now, I have to look at the comprehensive perspective of all of the other components that came to fruition. So it wasn't just the mere restraint, but it was also, like I mentioned, the K2, the mental health, and the homelessness was something that was driving him to ask or demand money from the people on that subway car. We had the initial interview, and Mr. Penny was able to go home because, like I mentioned, it was an interview. He was free to go. The police did not feel as if probable cause was established. Probable cause is the standard of proof necessary to conduct an arrest. At a later point, the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, believed that he wanted to have Mr. Penny arrested, and he believed that probable cause would be established by means of a grand jury. So Alvin Bragg enters this case into a grand jury. Well, he first has Mr. Penny arrested. Mr. Penny is arrested, and then the district attorney Alvin Bragg presents this to a grand jury, and an indictment comes down.
And Darrin,
And
let me
I'm
stop you
sorry.
there. This is no, not at all. This is great. Again, you hit on something that I think is very important. And we have some clips. They're short clips of the interview that the NYPD detectives conducted with with Daniel Penny. And one of the things you talked about was him wanting law enforcement there. I'm not sure which clip it is, but I have that when he talks to the detectives about his mindset. And it's one of these three clips that we have. Anthony, if you could, can you play the first clip at 9:24 to 10:27 for us?
So the door's closed. He's still yelling, "I want this, this, and this. I want Sprite. I want ginger ale." When does he throw the jacket?
As soon as that's like, so the door's closed, he throws the jacket,
And then
and that's when he starts like, if I get this, I'm willing to go to jail forever. I'll kill you, this, that, and that.
And
Anyway, so.
is he going up to people specifically saying he'll kill them, or he's just kind of yelling in the air? Or,
It's like it's the heat of the moment.
I don't know. It happens fast.
Yeah.
But when he's doing this, is he staying still, or is he kind of moving up and down the?
But he's moving like a little bit. He's like getting people's faces, like people starting to out of his and stuff. And
Okay.
yeah.
So he says, if I don't get this, I'm going to kill everyone. Something
Go to
that.
jail forever.
Yeah.
I'm willing to.
Is it at that point that's when you get up and decide to put him in the hole? Because it looks like a sleeper hole to me, like
Right.
something
Yeah.
similar to like.
I'm not trying to kill the guy.
Right.
I'm just trying to de-escalate the situation. Right.
I understand.
No.
I understand.
Daniel.
Yeah. So the reason I played that one is because he made it clear from the start that he perceived a public safety threat, that this guy was making specific threats. And again, we're going to get to Alvin Bragg, because this is the second part of what I want to talk about. But he said this is an interview. He's free to go, and he is giving, like I said, these free statements to the detectives, and really kind of, there's a setup there. Now, this is about a 30-minute interview from beginning to end. But I pulled a few clips there. But I think it's very important for people to try to put themselves in Daniel Penny's shoes and try to imagine what he was seeing and what he was hearing. And I think he did a very good job there. Now, he said that, hey, I wasn't trying to kill anybody, and obviously, but again, it goes to his mindset here about simply stopping the threat. What's your take on that clip there, Darrin?
Well, Mark, what you stated was true, but what's missing from that interview is the eyewitness interviews. And the eyewitness interviews support Daniel Penny's testimony in that interview. The eyewitnesses that were in that subway car specifically state that they were threatened. They were in fear of their safety. And so it wasn't just what Daniel Penny said, but this was corroborated by the other people in the subway car. In addition to that, Daniel Penny has been the focal point, but there was another person that assisted Daniel Penny in the restraint of Jordan Neely. So it was clear that it wasn't just Daniel Penny's vision that perceived that there was a credible threat, but there were other people that corroborated this as well.
Well, 100%. And that's the reason I shared this, because I wanted to talk about that, ask you about that. In other words, this is the important thing. You were a detective. I was a state trooper, California Highway Patrol for 30 years. And this is exactly right. People can say anything they want to, but when you start actually validating those statements, it's through other people's consistent statements. That's exactly right. And the statements we heard from the witnesses on that train certainly were in complete coordination, not coordination of the word, they were consistent with what Daniel Penny was saying. I think this is the point you said about him wanting the police there and hoping the cops would get there in the second clip. And there's just 3 of these short clips I believe I have here. If you can play, Anthony, the second clip, 11:06 to 11:47 for us, please.
What made you want to get involved? What made you?
Well, I mean, he's threatening people, and I'm not confrontational, not a confrontational guy. In the Marine Corps, I felt the need to step in.
Yeah.
There's women, children on the train. I'm sure there's ladies there that will vouch for me. And
He felt like he was threatening other people. You felt like
he was absolutely.
Did you feel like someone's life was in danger?
100%.
Now, how long was this interaction? How long do you hold him in place?
Well, he's squirming up until the cops come, and then he stops. And I got those other 2 guys to help me keep him there.
At any given time while he.
That's exactly right. There's actually another clip. We're not going to play it here because I think I made my point. There's still he was squirming till the cops got there. The other guy was helping me. I think he said other guys were helping me here. And that, but in the third clip, he says he said, "Hey, I wanted to stick around till the cops got there." In other words, there was nothing in his statement that indicated that he wanted to flee the scene. He felt he'd done anything wrong, that there was anything negligent or anything excessive use of force in his mind. That's the important thing. That's his mindset. Um, and we've all been in those situations where we've had people, obviously, who fled the scene, who are not willing to talk to you. Daniel Penny, he gave fresh statements. This is very, very close to the time of the incident, and they were very consistent with what we heard through transcripts from the witnesses in court. Is that fair to say, Darrin?
Absolutely. And this was his statements were consistent all the way through. But you bring up a very important point, Mark. This was immediately after the incident, coupled with Daniel Penny is not a person that's looking to be surreptitious, but he wants to stand and allow law enforcement the ability to gain the information because Daniel Penny genuinely believes that he did what was right to protect those citizens in that subway car. He mentions there are women and children in that subway car. Imagine if your mother or your child was in that same subway car and you knew that there was a person that had the ability to protect them, but that individual elected to take a step back and let your family take a beating. How would you feel about that? And there's another piece to this that's not really coming up from a racial perspective. Bear in mind, I'm African American and Daniel Penny's a white guy. Jordan Neely was a black guy. Imagine if Daniel Penny was a black guy. You wouldn't have heard about this as much. You would. So when we have cross-race references in instances like this, it becomes far more exemplified. But if it was an African American person that was that was applying this restraint to Jordan Neely, you wouldn't have heard about it.
Well, I couldn't agree more. We talked about this in the previous show on this topic. I said we really focus on the racial aspect of it, and I made the same point. I'm glad that you are because I like being validated by people who are smarter than I am. I could not agree more that if either the racial roles or makeup were reversed or Daniel Penny were black, we would not be hearing about this. And by the way, you said not hearing about it as much. I really don't think we'd heard about it at all. And that may be, a pretty heavy statement. The reason I say that is because how many black on black crimes do we hear about from New York City? Not a whole lot. And they have to be extraordinarily impactful to hear about it because it doesn't fit the narrative, Darrin. It does not fit the narrative that cops are racist and blacks are always the victim of racism and things like this. It doesn't fit the narrative. And so I don't think we would have heard, if anything, it would have been terribly, terribly minimal about this. And I made it clear in this last show that I believe that at least some of the motivation from Bragg to prosecute was based on racial bias. That is my take on it. Maybe not. Can I prove it? But that's my take on it. The point here I want to make about this interview and we're not going to play it because it's just empty, but there's about a 7-minute period, and you can talk to this from perspective of a former detective. There's about a 7-minute gap. These detectives say, hey, Daniel, listen, hey, we're going to go out and talk about things for a little bit. They leave him in that room for 7 minutes by himself. And they go out and then come back in, and we'll play the very final clip. And Anthony, when you're ready, it's going to be the final clip at 24:35 to 25:21. But when I'm looking at this, the reason I bring this up, Darrin, is because so many people, these Black Lives Matter activists that came out afterwards and said the cops wanted to, they didn't want to prosecute, they didn't want to charge this case from the beginning. They were all on Daniel Penny's side. They're racist too. They just threw it out. I've interviewed and interrogated a lot of people over the years. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, give me your perspective on this. But when they leave that room for 7 minutes, is it always just because they're trying to get their ducks in a row together as two, interviewers and investigators? or is there any psychological aspect here that they're trying to use with the interviewee before they come back in and ask him another series of questions?
Well, it bifurcates. I've done both. I've
Mhm.
intentionally left an interview and left the person in there because I'm looking through a two-way mirror, and I'm actually looking to assess what are their behaviors. There's certain
Mhm.
things that you're trained to assess when you're looking at a person in terms of, are they nervous? Uh, are they confident? And so that's one of the things that I would do. Or I would walk out of the room and I'd say, just give me a few minutes. I'd walk out of the room and just make the observation. But there's another side that I may have actually left the room because I wanted to check with my supervisor, because this was somewhat of a high profile case, to ensure that, look, do we have all of our ducks in a row? Did I check off all the boxes? Because a lot of times, even like DAs will sit in and watch these interviews. I've had instances where these interviews have been conducted where I've had an assistant district attorney sitting down right next to me, and then we've both pulled out and done the same thing. So it's really dependent upon what the investigators' vision on this particular interview is. But I just kind of want to back up and go into one thing that you brought up that was very significant. We speak to the black on black crime. If it was a black person, we've already established that, the chances are it wouldn't have been such a high profile case. But I would say this about New York, which I was very proud to see. I was actually shocked. You had Black Lives Matter. We have a Black Lives Matter chapter here in New York that is commissioned by a guy by the name of Hawk Newsom,
Mhm.
and it was clear they had a very minimal presence on this. They didn't have a lot of people out there, and it was just amazing because I saw the television cameras that were providing a view to what was going on. They had a very small number of protesters out there, and that spoke volumes to me that New York genuinely believed in Daniel Penny and believed that the actions that he took were appropriate. So what you saw through the lens of the media in terms of protesters, it was very, very minimal.
Darren, that's a very, very important point. We actually played clips of Newsom talking about this, the response to the acquittal, and uh, listen, I was wondering, hey, are there going to be riots, protests, whatever you want to call them? And really, to my knowledge, nothing happened. And I
Not even
think
close.
not even close. He said, you're shocked about this, and I am too. Very surprised, if not shocked. And I think it's an excellent point that maybe, Darren, maybe we've turned the corner here and people are saying, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Maybe the cops are not the problem. Could things be better, blah, whatever. But maybe they're saying, look, eh, we have to face it. It's not white people, white cops that are killing, 99% of black men as other black men. It's just a hard reality. But maybe that reality is setting in. And I'm glad you brought that point up, because I'll tell you right now, George Floyd, or any number of people that we can talk about, over the years, over the last decade, 15 years, may have resulted in a lot of unrest. Not this time. I'm glad you brought that point up. The final clip I want to play on here, Darren, and then I want to get into Alvin Bragg, is this clip. This is right after about the 7-minute break where they leave Penny in the room by himself. The detectives come back in. It's a short clip. And go ahead, Anthony, play that last clip there, up to
Sorry for
2021.
rehashing this. We just want to make sure we know we got it exactly right. He gets on the train, he throws the jacket, he starts yelling. You put him in the hold from behind, um, and you basically hold him until it gets to the next stop, and then two gentlemen jump in and you kind of break off.
That's correct.
Do you take him to the ground when you have him in the hold, or are you just holding him upright?
Yeah, I take him to the ground.
You
yes.
take him to the ground.
Yes.
How soon after you put him in the hold do you take him to the ground?
Immediately.
Immediately. Is that why you kind of wrap your legs around, like what you demonstrated
Yes.
him? Like I said, I don't train, so I don't know.
Right.
So
I mean, if
is that something that helps you bring people to the ground?
It just helps detain someone from
Okay.
from lashing out.
So you're holding him on the ground. I'm
That's
assuming
right.
you're underneath him,
Yes.
right? And he's on top of you. You still have your legs around his legs?
Yes.
Both legs?
One leg at one point, because when he starts squirming around, I kind of lose grip of one leg, so I have him with one.
What are his arms doing at that point? Is he trying? Is he?
Yeah, he's grabbing on. He's like grabbing on. He's like trying to hit me.
The reason I play that final clip, and ladies and gentlemen, you can watch the entire interview. It's 30 minutes long. But the reason I play that final clip, Darrin, and for the audience, is that from my perspective, these detectives had got outside, and again, we don't know exactly. I don't know exactly why they went out. You know, they wanted to play games with Daniel Penny. In other words, psychological, let him kind of stew in his own juices, so to speak. Or if they wanted to get their ducks in a row, like you said, they wanted to go talk to a supervisor. But when they come back in, if you watch the entire interview, that short clip there, it summarizes a lot of questions they'd asked him before. In other words, I think they were looking for clarity and consistency in his statements, and I think that they got it. The reason I make that point, give my opinion about that, is because, again, like I said before, there are a lot of claims out there, again, from these BLM activists and other groups out there that are saying that the cops went in with a mindset to exonerate him. I think nothing more could be further from the truth. They went in there as professionals, objective, get the facts, and then make a recommendation. So that's the final thing I'll say on that. What's your take on that, Darrin?
I think it's spot on. The one thing about the NYPD is that I don't think there's any organization that has more micromanagement than the NYPD. So you probably had maybe 10 tiers of people that had to check off on what was going on. So although you had the detectives that were sitting in, oh man, NYPD really doesn't give you much room to do what you want to do to work autonomously, especially in these types of interviews. So I genuinely believe that was it. But the other side could be, hey, look, we just want to make sure that we do have a level of consistency. And I will tell you firsthand, I have never seen a situation where someone came in and the plan was just to cut the person loose. Like, look, let's get him in here for formality, but let's just get him out of the door because we're okay with what they did. Oftentimes, things are not what they may appear to be on a surface value. So
Yeah.
you have a situation where there was a person that was taken in there was a person that lost their life based on another individual trying to restrain them. You don't know until you sit down and get that meat and bones in that chair to have that conversation to establish what happened. So the cops are not just going to kind of just cut this guy out or have the intent on cutting him out before they even get in there, because I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure you can attest to the same thing. How many times have we saw a situation that appeared one way and then it turned out to be another way after the interview? So the cops were doing what they were supposed to do.
Yeah, I think they were, and you're absolutely right. And we're all trained that way, to be objective, look at the facts, take your personal bias out of it. But we're also human, and something can appear to be totally clear upon first observation, but you have to go back to your training. You have to go back to your oath about simply looking at the facts. And that's what trained investigators, detectives do when they do it right. And I think that NYPD, and specifically these two detectives, did it just right. And in no way, shape, or form, like you said, did they go with a mindset to exonerate this guy. In other words, what what are they invested in? In other words, why would they want to go one way or the other? Their job is just to find out what happened in this case. Simple as that. And I think they did it very, very well. Moving on to our favorite prosecutor, Alvin Bragg. First thing I want to talk about, Darrin, and of course, yeah, I say that tongue in cheek. The first thing I want to talk about, and just real quickly, the elements of the crime. In other words, when we're looking at crimes as cops, we have to establish elements. We go with the penal code, the vehicle code, whatever it is, and we have to look at what the elements of the crime are, and then we have to find out, do these elements apply in this particular situation? Did X, Y, Z happen according to the law? Can you tell us, just in layman's terms, so I and everybody else can understand, what are the elements of second-degree manslaughter in the state of New York?
Well, the best way to describe manslaughter is you don't have the intent. The intent is not to cause a serious physical injury or death. Um, and that is when we have the intent to cause a serious physical injury or death, and we cause the death, that's when we have murder. And then we have, I know you asked me about manslaughter, but I just kind of want to bring this
Abs-
down the chain. So
Please
with
do.
Right, right. So if you intend to kill someone and you cause that person's death, we have murder. If you're acting in a capacity of being super reckless and you cause a person's death, that's murder as well. And I'll give you an example, super reckless. If I put a bunch of cans on the top of my roof and I have my AK-47 and I'm shooting the cans, should I understand that there's a perceived risk in these bullets hitting the can and killing someone across the street? Yes, but I disregard that risk, and that would amount to murder. Now, when I think about manslaughter, the manslaughter is different because now we intend a physical injury and we cause the death of someone. So, an example of intending to cause a physical injury, which results to someone's death, is I get into a fight with someone and I punch the person in the face. I punch the person in the face, they fall to the ground, they hit their head on the curb, and they die. That would be an example of a manslaughter. I intended one thing, but I caused something else. And the intent here from the manslaughter perspective that the district attorney was pushing was based on they use the term chokehold, and I refer to it as a restraint, not a chokehold. Because a chokehold is just there's two different sides of it. Like you can either, if you are applying pressure to the sides of the neck, then it would cause the blood that flows from the body to the brain to be limited, and you can cause the person to black out. That's one aspect. The second aspect, which is the actual choke, is when you apply pressure to the esophagus and you limit or you outright close the airway that allows air to go to the brain. That would be an example of a choke. So we have two different aspects of it. But just going back to the manslaughter component, I believe the district attorney was pushing the fact that Daniel Penny intended to either stop the flow of blood to the head or to stop the flow of oxygen to the head. However, in the process of that, that's what caused his death. So the intent wasn't to cause death, but the intent was to actually asphyxiate or even or limit the flow of blood that went to the head. So that was the aspect of the manslaughter. But it was clearly not there because the jury hung. When I say the jury hung, meaning the jurors did not commit to Daniel Penny was guilty of the manslaughter. So you had some that did and some that didn't, and they meaning the jurors had to go with another charge, which was the criminally negligent homicide, because it was the prosecutor that identified that, look, I'm not going to get anything with the manslaughter, so let me go with the criminally negligent homicide. However, with the criminally negligent homicide, the jurors were unanimous in believing that Daniel Penny was not guilty of this. And I give you an example of a criminally negligent homicide. Oftentimes, you see this in either DWI cases or a medical practitioner. And let's say we get a medical doctor that's doing an operation on someone's heart. And the way the medical practitioner was trained, they should have been able to determine that whatever process they were going through was not what they were supposed to do, but they did it and it caused a person's death. The same holds true with a DWI. If a person is driving, they don't intend to kill somebody because they're drunk, but they run into someone and they kill a person. That's how, in many ways, we have a criminally negligent homicide. So, in this situation right here, the jurors clearly believed, which they were absolutely right, that it wasn't even close to a criminally negligent homicide because the actions of Daniel Penny did not rise commensurate with that. And so, the short version of it is he got off. I shouldn't even say he got off. I don't think he should have been tried in the first place. I think that this was something, as you mentioned in the earlier part of this, Daniel District Attorney Bragg pushed a political agenda and not an agenda that suited the appropriate charging of a defendant in this particular case. Justice came to fruition. Daniel Penny was acquitted, and now the district attorney has egg all over his face.
Yeah, well, he has egg all over his face, and from the size of him, I think he's eaten too many eggs. But anyway, that's just an editorial. But yeah, this is the thing with Bragg. When we last week we talked about, I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but the self-defense bodega case a couple of years ago, where the attendant there in that bodega defended himself with a cutting tool, a knife, and the perpetrator died. And Bragg throws this guy in Rikers Island, charged him with murder. I mean,
terrible.
It just absolutely terrible. When you juxtapose that incident with the Penny case, I mean, I think anybody objectively can't help but think there's bias on the part of the DA. There has to be, because how can anyone look, I think it was a 62-year-old man, I believe, whatever he was, who's defending himself against an aggressive assailant who makes his way behind the counter, assaults this guy, and the proprietor there, or the attendant, simply defends himself. How can anybody possibly see that as murder? And then you come back here with the Penny case, and you have a would-be perpetrator. You have certainly a threat, public safety, who's making these clear threats, and then you charge a person who defends an entire subway car full of innocent people. This is where you're thinking, like when you said earlier about the social contract, it seems like the DA is in clear violation of the social contract, because he is a law enforcement official. His job is also to look at the facts objectively and prosecute or not prosecute based on the facts. And it certainly does not seem like this fella is doing this with a blindfold on. It seems like he's bringing his personal bias and prosecuting based on that. And on that, we finish it up. But I want to get your editorial on Alvin Bragg as much as you like before we close the show.
It's unfortunate the citizens of the borough of Manhattan have elected Alvin Bragg as a district attorney, because he's failed to afford them the appropriate protections under the law to assist in prosecuting those individuals that should be prosecuted, and not prosecuting the individuals that are not guilty. And this has just been a downward spiral through his tenure. And I don't believe that he'll be reelected. And I see strong parallels between him and Gascon in Los Angeles. Fortunately, they got Gascon out of there, which was the right thing. And just a matter of time before we get Alvin Bragg out of there.
Well, I'll tell you right now, I certainly I supported Nathan Hochman in Los Angeles County. I've had Nathan Hochman on the show, who beat Gascon by, I think he got 70% of the vote, Hochman. And I agree with you, Darrin, that when you have these huge districts, these huge counties, in New York with Bragg, in Los Angeles with Gascon, former.
And remember, Oberdeen in San Francisco, they did the same thing with him, right?
Excellent
Got him
point.
out of there.
Yeah, you're a walking encyclopedia of these names. You're absolutely right. I think we are seeing a trend.
The lunatics are easy to triangulate.
That's exactly right. Well said, my friend. I hope we're seeing this trend here. I think law enforcement is clawing their way back to the respect that they deserve. Again, no institution, no profession, and no individual is perfect. But law enforcement does a damn good job on the whole. And again, phenomenal job. And I hope with that the profession's clawing its way back to get the respect that it deserves. And with the help of these, like you said, these lunatic DAs being voted out of office, being thrown out, I think we're well on our way to seeing that. Darrin Porcher, it has been a pleasure. We are grateful for you to give us your time, your insight, your expertise, my friend. And I certainly look forward to having you back on the show when the timing's right for the next high-profile incident, an impactful incident in regards to public safety and to law enforcement. God bless you, my friend. Stay safe and keep preaching, my friend. Get the word out there. We look forward to seeing you again.
Look forward. And Mark, thank you for having me as a guest on this podcast. And I look forward to a repeat session later on down the line.
Absolutely. Take care.